All right. I want to bring in our next guest. We're joined with Arnaud. There we go. Arnaud. I'm sorry. Arnaud Delver. Delver.
Develay.
Thank you, Develay. For some reason, I could not speak this morning. Um, Arnaud, thank you for this, man. Thank you for joining me. Arnaud Develay is an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in the defense of former President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanctioned regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of American Political Consensus. Arnaud, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you, Jamal, and thank you for this nice introduction.
No, man. I appreciate it. I guess let's start here. Are we in the Third World War? That'd be provocative.
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it?
Yeah.
To be sure, I was listening to a French podcast. Actually, it was a cable news network, not one of the most objective one at that. But it's always interesting to understand how the Western media outlet frame the debate on such sensitive issues. Right. And one of the guests on that night was a former diplomat from the Soviet Union. So someone who doesn't have a bone in this, really. And he came and basically explained that, according to him, having gone through the Cold War and comparing it with the period that we are going through right now, according to him, this is the most dangerous period humanity has ever gone through.
I agree with him.
Bar none. So he explained essentially that whereas during the apex of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, there were always not only capable people at the helm, but also constant lines of communication thereafter, because the Cuban Missile Crisis is the episode which heralded the use of the so-called red lines, red phones. We have no communication these days between the departing Biden administration and its Russian counterpart. This was stated as recently by Sergei Lavrov, who says we have no communication whatsoever with the State Department or anybody, the National Security Office advisor office in the Biden administration whatsoever. And so when you have no communication whatsoever, obviously you are left with a situation where you have to guess what's going on in the mind of your interlocutor.
Yeah.
And this makes for a hicky situation, to say the least. So this is where we are right now.
Yeah. And I think on top of that, there's another element to it. It's not just we don't have any communication. The West doesn't seem to respect Russia in the way that it respected the Soviet Union. Like even during the Cold War, even though they considered them to be enemies, there was still a respect. There was still this notion of you can sit down, you can talk, you can have a conversation. There was an understanding that both sides could end the world. That doesn't seem to be there right now. I'm going to give you an example. This is Sir Keir Starmer, the one who, at this point, the country is trying to recall, and they should recall him, especially after making this speech. I want to get your take on this. This is astonishing. They're asking him point blank, you understand that Russia could attack us, that we are a legitimate target because we are now a party to this conflict. You get that, right? Listen to what Starmer has to say about this. This is just, again, shocking that a world leader will look in the face of nuclear oblivion and say this.
Just quickly, Russia's also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
even if Russia unleashes nuclear war.
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift. But we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine, it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war? Because that is what Russia is threatening.
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict, and there is a very high cost if Russian aggression is seen to pay off.
That's astonishing. That's just astonishing. He is being confronted point blank. You understand that we can be hit and this can end up in a nuclear war if the escalation continues. And his response is, well, we have to keep going because if Russia wins, the world will come to an end. And maybe from their point of view, that's what it boils down to, right? This idea of this hegemonic control of the West. They feel it's slipping and they feel that they bet it all in Ukraine. And if Ukraine fails, meaning if Russia wins, that hegemonic control fails also. But the rub is they have already lost in Ukraine. All of this stuff, Colonel McGregor describes it as giving a dead man a shave. Basically, it's like you're giving the guy a shave, but the guy's already a corpse. Give me your take on this. I mean, like, this is pretty astonishing.
Well, the first thing that strikes me is that they all share the same elements of language, whether it's Starmer, Macron, Trudeau. They all sound like bots. They all sound like they're reading right off a script, which was written by somebody else. Those people have no gravitas or any kind of depth as politicians. Most of them are, you would say, political operators who basically cater to the most interesting and attractive offer in order to promote their own career. There's no sense of statesmanship, which is what we lack in the West these days. We lack a statesman. And I may say that at the international level, the only two persons today who approximate this qualification are Vladimir Putin and the Chinese premier. Those people understand the weight of history. They understand where we stand right now. They understand how dangerous those waters that we are navigating through right now can be if one does not take into account a whole range of factors. And so you have to speak somehow quietly. And when we hear the Western leaders, quote unquote, we get the idea that they are trying to up one another in the most inflammatory statement, as if they are being graded, and they're trying to. It's all about trying to find out who is going to be getting the valedictorian title, upon graduation day, in the warmongering rhetoric. So obviously, this is a different generation of leaders that they were selected. Most of them are members of supranational clubs, whether it's the Bilderberg Group, whether it's the World Economic Forum. In France, most of the political class are issued from the French-American Foundation, which has its own young leader program. And so, to be sure, going back to Sarkozy, every single one of them is definitely right on, the program. And it's all about advancing and promoting transatlantic interest, at the expense of their own country. One of the ways to do this is to call for basically dismantling the very idea of independent foreign policy, unfortunately. And so today, if we were to begin to appreciate how to solve the situation in Ukraine, everybody understands that Washington is the person you want to talk to.
Right.
But until we get someone, who's understanding the stakes, unfortunately, we have to navigate those 55 days. And this is a period fraught with perils, unfortunately, because we're dealing with not only tens of thousands of careers in NATO per se, but also a whole political class. I'm sorry to say, without sounding partisan, but somewhat connoted on the Democratic Party side, who have made fortunes in Ukraine, who have overseen lots of I would say, almost diabolical activities there, bearing on those biolabs, bearing on experimentation on the local population, keeping in
Go
mind that
into that
those
for me for a
activities.
moment, because Tulsi Gabbard had mentioned this, that they were biolabs, and every so often I would see a report that they were labs in Ukraine without necessarily going fully into the details. What's going on with the biolabs? Are they? I mean, from my understanding, the thought is that they were using that for experimentation in the war, that they were making bioweapons in Ukraine with those labs. What's going on with this?
Well, interestingly enough, ever since that sequence in March 2022, when Victoria Nuland was queried on the issue during a congressional hearing, and she snapped back at one of the senators who was asking, I think it was Marco Rubio, as a matter of fact, who was asking her that, funnily enough. And she quickly snapped, saying there's no such thing, and to the extent there is a suspicion of nefarious activities bearing on violation of the bacteriological treaty, it's the Russians, and so we're making sure that the Russians don't get access to what is, by and large, pretty innocuous activities, but that if it falls in the hand of the Russians, it could become a catastrophe. And so, I think Dr. Carlson might have spoken about it in one of his podcasts ever since, but that's about it. We haven't really heard much about it. But suffice it to say that the United States has had an extensive activity in Ukraine going back to 2005 and accelerating in 2008 through the DTRA, the Defense Threat Agency, which is this somewhat arcane extension of the DoD, which deals with those kind of programs. The idea was to basically skirt U.S. prohibition on those activities being operated on U.S. soil, and Ukraine was the perfect playing ground for this. And so we know for a fact that there were gain of function research being carried out in those labs, bearing on smallpox, cholera, any kind of bird flu types of family of viruses, but with the idea of propping them up, putting them on steroids. And to the extent this one day gets verified, we have for the time being, no hardcore evidence, but there definitely are rumors circulating that researches were going on bearing on adapting some of those pathogens on the idea of targeting specific ethnic groups, i.e. Slavic ethnic groups. And that one of the reasons why Russia intervened above and beyond preventing the genocidal assault on the eastern population of Ukraine, ex-Ukraine, should I say, was to prevent those programs from being activated and becoming itself proper a target of dissemination of pathogen via bird migration routes.
I'm curious on something else. Wow, I was showing the Victoria Nuland thing where she was talking about the biolabs. I didn't play the clip, but I was showing the
yeah, you should play
background
it
of it.
actually.
Oh, I can play it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This was Victoria Nuland being questioned by Marco Rubio. It's on C-SPAN, so anybody can see it for themselves. You're absolutely right. Let's hear it.
Biological research facilities, which in fact we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian.
Think about that. He asked her a question about, hey, do you have biolabs in Ukraine? And her response is, yes, we do have biolabs. And then the next one is, but it's totally Russian propaganda if those biolabs, if anything is leaked. Yes, it's totally Russian propaganda if it's leaked. So A, you have biolabs. B, you were doing research in Ukraine. C, you're concerned that the Russians are approaching those biolabs. But if anything happens in regards to a biological thing, the Russians did it. Like, this is outrageous.
Exactly.
Russia blew up its own pipeline. I mean, this is outrageous. Like, the propaganda to them is just inconvenient truth. That's all. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely
Well,
amazing.
it gives us an idea of how the inner workings of those people's minds. I mean, they're really, they sound sociopathic in a way. I mean, always like narcissistic.
Not in a way. They're
Perverts.
sociopaths in general.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
They're blaming.
Yeah.
They're blaming everybody else, but for their own, turpitude.
Yeah.
And
They acknowledge
they
that,
say
yes,
that with
these are
such a deadpan way that, it's almost believable in a way. If you don't really, have an idea of what the background is, you would believe those people, watching them lie like this right to a congressman's face.
It's just astonishing. Well, Rubio is on board. Like, she wasn't even lying to her.
Yeah, of course.
Rubio's the one that even introduced it. But if anything happens, it's the Russians, right? Yes, it's the Russians. If anything happens, let me ask you this: from what do you think? Like, do you think that the U.S. at this point is aiming for a war, or do you think they believe Putin is bluffing? I can't necessarily tell which, to be honest, at this point, because Putin has been very clear. I mean, A, this is happening on the Russian border. B, it is obviously existential to Russia. I mean, the entire point of this is about their security guarantees or security needs that have been flagrantly ignored over the past 20, 30 years. Do you think that in their minds, Putin is totally bluffing? He would never hit a Western base. And so we can continuously escalate on him with the belief set that he will stop at some point? Or is their mind, we're okay with a war, especially if it takes a war to maintain some kind of hegemonic control of the globe? I can't tell which one it is at this point because it seems deranged either way. But what is your thinking about their thinking, if that makes sense?
Well, I personally think, it's just my personal opinion, but this has to do with the latter, i.e., they're concerned about having to answer finally for some of the ill policies that they've been conducting this last two and a half decades. And they've grossly miscalculated. They've squandered tons of monies and blood resources and, you name it, with the idea that their plan, their undermining of Russian political independence, and thereby their taking over of Russia's resources would basically be a success. And they underestimated Russia, to be sure. They underestimated the leadership, the Russian leadership. They basically, threw a Hail Mary on this, thinking that the next step would be China. We would be seizing Russian resources, marking a pause for a few years, consolidate, and then go after the last remaining bloc, on the way to global hegemony. And they just basically are trying to swallow a bone right now, which is just not getting through.
So you really wait, real quick. So you really believe that they thought that they were going to win this? That Ukraine, like they were going to destroy the Russian economy, Ukraine was going to destroy the Russian military, Ukraine was going to become part of NATO, in which case they can
not part of NATO, no. It would become like a periphery of NATO, but one under control with a fifth column, ready to basically make things easy for the new overlords. A little bit like what we've seen in Iraq, after the U.S. invasion there.
Right, right.
So essentially, that basically blew in the neocons' face. I mean, the neocon were, some of the most prominent advocates. This has, to be sure, been a long pursued policy going back to, at least the 19th century by the British Empire at the time. But the neocons, for a various array of reasons, including personal reasons, really had this animus against Russia, and they pursued this policy ever since the end of the Cold War.
Hmm.
And so they basically, strong of their takeover of the Washington politics, foggy bottom belongs to them, for better or for worse. There's no alternative. They defeated the paleoconservatives 25 years ago. They, through a tightly knit network of think tanks and media outlets, have completely penetrated all the institutions of the federal government to such an extent that whether you're dealing with a Democratic or Republican administration, they reinvent themselves constantly in a
Yeah.
way that allows them to keep going. And they also act as interface. They create a new market that Wall Street needs. So it's a perfect, in a way, perfect system for them. It promotes what they perceive as American interest under a veneer of democracy peddling. They enrich their backers, and they consolidate their own stranglehold on the federal machinery. So it's a win-win situation for them until they take on a peer-to-peer nation such as the
Right.
Russian Federation, and things start going wrong. And this is what we are dealing with right now. They should have already taken a lesson out of what happened in Syria in the color revolutions in
Right.
the Middle East, what they call the so-called Arab Spring. Syria was the turning of the tide, and what happened there? Well, everything started collapsing the moment Russia stepped in, following that UN General Assembly speech by Putin on September 29th, 2015.
Hmm.
And within 18 months, the entire policy in Syria, and by extension, throughout the Middle East, because don't forget that Syria was but a stepping stone on the way to Iran.
That's right.
The idea is to neutralize Iran. Well, the moment Russia stepped in to preserve its own interest in the region, not necessarily out of pro-Assad feelings, but the idea was that the protection of Russian interest in the Middle East basically illustrated itself through the preservation of the Assad government. And so this should have been a warning sign for them that there's a new player in town and we should take that into account. But instead of composing themselves, recalibrating their policy in a way that allows for this new factor, they double down.
Yeah.
Because right after the Red Line episode in August 2013, off the coast of Syria, we had actually NATO fleets, or US fleet mostly, i.e. NATO. And on the other side, we had the Russian fleet barring access to an amphibious assault. This had been peddled at the time by Obama, who had peddled this notion of red line, and
Right.
the use of chemical
Chemical
weapons
weapons.
would be that
Right.
red line. So that was the Syrian version of the Iraq's WMDs.
They were trying to use that as
justify
tripwire. Yeah.
exactly. And that failed. It was a bluff. The French and the Brits were on board. Everybody was ready to go for the kill. And at some point, everything failed. The Russians called their bluff and they folded. So what happens a year later, as a means of getting back at Putin, quote unquote, they ignited the Maidan, the coup d'etat in Ukraine.
Hmm.
And basically they, out of feeling insulted, that their plans had been checked in the Middle East, they decided that they would take the fire right on Russians' borders. That does not mean this would not have happened down the road, but somehow it was definitely a factor. They wanted to show Putin who was the boss, allegedly. And in so doing, they miscalculated. They miscalculated greatly. They precipitated their own situation.
No, I agree with you, because I keep saying, I've said before that Joe Biden has been the worst president that we've ever had. And part of my reason for that has to do with this notion of this inability to control empire, that Joe Biden's reach exceeded his grasp, that whereas Obama limited what he was willing to do to what he believed that the US was capable of doing, thereby not going beyond US capability. So he would make the deal with Iran for the JCPOA. He would overthrow the government of Ukraine, but he wouldn't give them offensive weapons, because under his model, Russia always had escalatory dominance. Basically, Russia could always escalate in a way that the US could necessarily compensate unless they were willing to go to nuclear war. Obama had limits in a way that Joe Biden didn't seem to understand that America had limits, thereby getting himself into situations that ultimately he couldn't control, that he couldn't deal with the issue from the standpoint of Iran in real terms. Iran right now was supposed to strike Israel. The US can't really do anything about it in real terms. Same thing with Ukraine. They staked everything in Ukraine and fundamentally lost. And now we're in this kind of escalatory spiral that Obama was trying to avoid, that Joe Biden didn't have sense enough to try to stay out of. In regards to the spiral, if indeed it gets to the point where it's a direct exchange between Russia and NATO, whereas NATO activates, where does Turkey fall into this? Do you believe that Erdogan at any point would attack Russia on the side of NATO? Because I don't believe that he would. But what is your thoughts on this?
Well, it's difficult to try to figure out what goes on in Erdogan's head.
Very true.
The guy is a wily character. But he's a survivor. He understands how to navigate Turkish politics and world politics. He's a veteran of international politics. And so we could assume that it's not outside the realm of possibility that he would take a rain check on this one, which is very important, because Turkey has the second largest NATO army. So it's difficult for NATO to consider putting troops on the ground if Turkey is not on board.
Exactly.
Obviously.
I just have a hard time believing he'll be on board. Like, it seems that the relationship between Turkey and Russia has expanded, not contracted, even with everything that's taking place right now with NATO. He doesn't seem to be on board.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, not only that, but don't forget that Erdogan is the one who negotiated
Istanbul agreements. That's right.
Exactly. And also, I think he participated somewhat to the swapping of prisoners of wars later on in 2022.
Yeah.
And he announced recently that he would be amenable to host peace negotiation between the incoming Trump administration and the Kremlin. So Erdogan, as far as the Ukraine situation is concerned, has always been somewhat consistent and contributing to a positive and valuable search for a solution.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So
it's
difficult to fault him on this one.
Well, any kind of war, he would remember that Russia was open for a deal and the West basically killed it. I just don't believe he involved. But I could be wrong. Like you said, we don't know what's in his mind. Arnaud, thank you for this, man. I really appreciate you joining me this morning. Arnaud Develay, he is an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in the defense of former President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanction regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of America, Political Consensus. Definitely check that book out. Arnaud, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. All right.
Thank you very much,
thank you. I want to bring in our next guest.